Shuprabha. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this workshop on addiction management. I see a packed program schedule which I would have loved to be a part of. Therefore, my apologies to the event organizers for not being able to join you this time. I congratulate you also on choosing this beautiful BRAC CDM Sabar campus. I watched the staging of the building of this campus on YouTube, and I'm impressed with the infrastructure and students. Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard the presentation by Dr. Muhammad Zilul Rahman Khan on the situation in Bangladesh. Allow me to walk you through the overview of the situation in Southeast Asia and then zero in on the current situation in Malaysia. Ladies and gentlemen, methamphetamine remains the major drug of choice in Southeast Asia, followed by crystal methamphetamine or ice as it is known here, then cannabis and heroin. The abuse of methamphetamine increased in almost all Southeast Asian countries, and according to the ASEAN Drug Monitoring Report, the substance use were found to be spreading among younger and younger drug users. And therefore, a more community-based treatment approach was discussed, and it was emphasized that there should be a greater focus on sharing experience and information on this approach in treatment. Now, drug seizures increased in almost every Southeast Asian country since illicit trafficking was intercepted by air, sea, and land routes. In addition, there was also an emergence of illicit trafficking by mail in some of these countries, and these transactions were facilitated by online communication and payment. Now, approximately 60% of the Southeast Asian population is under the age of 35 and 43% is under the age of 24. The population of ASEAN will increase to 792 million people in 2050, and the economy, regional economy, is projected to grow by over 5% a year and become the fourth largest economy in the world by 2050. However, there is still the threat of unemployment. The rate of unemployment has increased across Southeast Asia, largely due to COVID, and the inability to find legitimate employment makes them vulnerable to risky behavior. In 2020 alone, an estimated 250,000 drug users in Southeast Asia were admitted into drug treatment. Considering the overall admissions in the ASEAN countries, over 80% of the people who were given treatment were methamphetamine users, both in terms of tablet as well as crystal. Now, cannabis users formed less than 10%, and the remainder were opiate users. So, obviously, there would be differentiated content provided in the treatment and rehabilitation according to the drug used. Interestingly, 10% of the overall admissions were women. And according to the studies in Thailand, a majority of them received treatment for the first time. As far as drug offenders rates are concerned, in the ASEAN region, it hovers around 80 per 100,000 population, while in Malaysia it is 70 per 100,000 population. So, narrowing in on Malaysia, for us, the policy is that the illicit use of drugs remains one of the main threats to national security, and synthetic drugs such as ATS continue to be a challenge to the government in achieving a drug-free state. Now, addiction has spread in the country, especially among youth and the middle class, and recently in rural population as well. In 2020, it was detected that addiction grew by an increase of 15% compared to the previous year. As far as relapse and repeat addicts were concerned, the increase was in the region of 25% compared to the previous years. And youth aged 19 to 39 have dominated in the number. And the use of ATS, especially methamphetamines, have substantially increased in recent years, with currently 65% of the total numbers is attributed to the use of meth crystals, tablets, and ecstasy. Now, opiates have come down to 30%, comprising of heroin, morphine, codeine, and methadone, while cannabis stands at 2.7%, and psychotropic pills are at 0.4%. 30% of these numbers are unemployed, according to the statistics obtained by the National Anti-Drug Agency. Currently, Kratom, as it is locally known, is the most commonly used newer psychoactive substances in Malaysia. Kratom, or the local name Kratom, is a plant where mitragynine, which is an alkaloid found in the Kratom leaves, is listed as psychotropic substances under the Malaysian Poisons Act of 1952. The law states that any activities relating to possessing, selling, using, transporting, and importing and exporting the use of Kratom are considered illegal and can be prosecuted. Interestingly, Kratom trees are not illegal, and no laws in Malaysia forbid the cultivation or presence of naturally growing Kratom. And therefore, the laws do very little to prosecute Kratom addicts. Also, because of the fact that there are no available Kratom test kits which can assist the enforcement agency to arrest and prosecute Kratom addicts. Now, as we all know, the laws related to illicit drugs remain very strict in Malaysia, and the penalty remains severe even for possession, and this has been largely reported internationally. Attempts to legalize the use of marijuana or cannabis for personal or medicinal purposes has not been enthusiastically received by the government. Even the idea to commercially cultivate Kratom plant locally to be exported to pharmaceutical companies abroad has not been encouraged by the government. There is a belief that the legalization of such drugs, such as cannabis, and cultivation of Kratom will bring more harm than benefit. But this is a discussion that has been reactivated, and it is continuing now. Other measures for demand reduction include prevention, education, introduction of voluntary treatment and rehabilitation known as cure and care clinics, or CNC clinics, throughout the country, and reintegration of former drug users into society. And for this purpose, a dedicated vocational center known as Cure and Care Vocational Center, or CCVC, has been established. Recognizing the specific needs of women affected by drug addiction, Malaysia for many years have set up a dedicated treatment center for women, which among others ensures that they have access to adequate health services and counseling, including those needed during pregnancy, while care is also given for their children and the specific needs of their children, including the opportunity for schooling. And now, extensive campaigns through mass media such as television and radio, and the new media such as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram have been launched and utilized to raise public awareness on harms and negative consequences of drugs, particularly the ATS. However, focused prevention programs which are community-based, targeting at high-risk groups in high-risk areas seem to be somewhat lacking. Now, as far as harm reduction is concerned, to control and reduce harms associated with illicit use of drugs, the government had approved harm reduction program way back in 2006 in the form of methadone maintenance therapy, which is part of this harm reduction program. And this methadone maintenance therapy had tremendously reduced the HIV infection rate among intravenous drug users from 79.6% in 2009 2001 to only 11% in 2016, and a further drastic reduction in 2020. However, the strategy adopted by the government is that of being very cautious as well due to the misuse of methadone. Now, we also set up what is known as the Substance Control Management Systems, or SPIKES, SPIKES, by the Pharmaceutical Division of the Ministry of Health, which worked very closely with the Special Tactical Intelligence Narcotics Group, or STING, STING, by the Royal Malaysia Police to cripple local and international drug pens and syndicates that continue to operate in the region. Extensive air and maritime traffic to and through Malaysia create high potential for traffickers to use Malaysia as a transit point for narcotics moving from one country to another, such as Hong Kong, Taiwan, China, Indonesia, and Australia via parcels, maritime containers, and even air cargo. As I mentioned earlier, there are challenges posed by new psychoactive substances that are not controlled in the international drug control treaties and therefore may pose a potential public health risk, and as well as the proliferation and diversion of chemical precursors in the use of illicit manufacture of narcotic drugs, and the psychotropic substances and emergence of new methods of diversion used by criminal groups also makes our enforcement agencies constantly trying to play catch up. Now, community and NGO involvement is crucial. The participation and engagement of various government agencies, civil societies, communities, and healthcare professionals was important in implementing demand reduction strategy, and that was crucial in our attempts to win the war against drugs. So in this regard, the Malaysian government launched the Malaysian Substance Abuse Council, or MASAC, which consists of various drug-related NGOs, in order for them to coordinate their efforts and contribute effectively towards lowering the drug demand reduction, especially in treatment and rehabilitation. Now, there was also an emphasis and a recommendation by this council that there should be evidence-based practices and capacity building, namely training and professional development programs like credentialing and education of addiction professionals. In this regard, I must congratulate my colleague Dr. Prem Kumar Shanmugam, who has been very influential and involved in this credentialing and education of addiction professionals. The economic loss due to addiction is tremendous. The government alone spends 300 million ringgit per year on treatment. There are no estimates on out-of-pocket treatment costs, but I can imagine that it must be running into several hundred million ringgit. The total loss in terms of economic terms due to disease burden could run into billions of ringgit. Now, the health approach policy executed by the government of Malaysia is very crucial because through this policy, there was a clear shift from the previous punitive and legal aspects of drug addiction and the problem of drug addiction towards looking at it from the perspective of health and that of it being a chronic disease. There was also a push on the establishment of connection between family and the client in treatment to ensure that it was the most appropriate therapeutic milieu to motivate and encourage clients to be more disciplined during the rehabilitation process. So the transformation of drug treatment and rehabilitation requires an active active participation from all levels of society and continuous efforts to ensure effectiveness of drug treatment and rehabilitation programs depends very much on all stakeholders, and that must include the family and the immediate community. Another point that I would like to also emphasize here is that effective harm reduction programs can be much more useful than incarceration, and I would like to draw your attention to the situation in Malaysia. Now, more than 50%, a large majority of those in prisons are there for drug-related offences. In 2017 alone, the Malaysian government spent 500 million ringgit for housing these drug-related offenders in jail. Now, if those funds could be used for effective community-based harm reduction programs, that would be much more useful and rewarding in the long run. And sadly, there is a 60% relapse rate in government facilities. Now, what went wrong in our approach for us to have a 60% relapse rate in our government facilities? In my mind, number one, there was a lack of a holistic approach in the treatment. There was more focus on detoxification rather than looking into the rehabilitation component. Offenders were in jail without treatment and without any access to rehabilitation approach. Dual diagnosis was missed out even when they were treated, and perpetuating mental health factors were not addressed, and therefore this resulted in a high relapse rate. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, like Bangladesh, Malaysia also battles with stigma in drug addiction. It is still seen as a personality defect. It is not generally by the general public recognized that it is a chronic disease that has to have a health perspective in dealing with it, and therefore it still is a continuous stigma continues to be a barrier in handling this problem or in treating people with substance use problems. Ultimately, the drug problem remains a common and shared responsibility of all stakeholders, and it can only be addressed through effective and respectful cooperation by all stakeholders, including family and community. And certainly also through increased international cooperation as well. Cooperation between Bangladesh and Malaysia has been well established, and I think we should take advantage of our long-term relationship and cultural similarities here. I hope to see you in Dhaka as soon as possible when I get well soon, inshallah. And I would also like to invite you to visit us in Malaysia. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for giving me this opportunity to be present here today, although in a virtual sense. Dhanyabad.